Thomas Morgan sat in his leather office chair, staring at the framed psychology degrees on his wall. 10 years of practice, and he still felt like a fraud sometimes. His latest book on modern masculinity had sold well, but the emptiness persisted. His phone buzzed. Another missed call from Sarah, his wife of 8 years. The distance between them had grown into a chasm neither knew how to cross. "Dr. Morgan?" His assistant peeked in. "Your new client is here." The woman who entered his office carried herself with quiet confidence. She introduced herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Jungian analyst visiting from Switzerland. "I read your book," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "You've misunderstood Jung's central lesson about the anima." Thomas stiffened. "I've studied Jung extensively." Elena smiled. "Knowledge isn't understanding. Jung believed that what men reject in themselves they project onto women. Your book speaks volumes about external mastery, but nothing of internal integration." "And you've come to correct me?" Thomas asked, defensiveness rising. "I've come to collaborate. I'm giving a series of lectures on the modern relevance of Jung's work. I thought we might have an interesting dialogue." Thomas nearly declined, but caught himself. Something in her words had struck a nerve, like she'd seen through his carefully constructed academic persona. "Perhaps," he said finally. "Send me the details." Later that night, as Sarah slept facing away from him, Thomas pulled Jung's collected works from his shelf. The passage Eleanor had referenced stared back at him. "The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow." Thomas arrived early to Elena's lecture, choosing a seat near the back. The auditorium filled with colleagues and students, many of whom nodded in recognition as they passed him. Elena spoke without notes, moving through Jung's concepts with the ease of someone who had internalized rather than merely memorized them. She explained how the masculine psyche often projects its unacknowledged feminine aspects, intuition, emotional sensitivity, receptivity, onto women, creating both attraction and resentment. "We are drawn to what we deny in ourselves," she said, "and what we're drawn to, we often try to control." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering the arguments with Sarah. Her accusation that he treated her more like a concept than a person. His insistence that she was too emotional when discussing their relationship problems. After the lecture, Elena spotted him. "What did you think, Dr. Morgan?" "Intellectually sound," he admitted, "but academic theory often fails in the messy reality of human relationships." She raised an eyebrow. "That's precisely where Jung's work becomes most relevant. In the messiness, theory is merely a map. The territory is lived experience." Thomas hesitated. "My wife and we're struggling. I don't know if Jung has answers for that." "Jung doesn't offer answers," Elena replied. "He offers a mirror. Would you be willing to look?" Thomas agreed to meet Elena weekly. Their first session took place in her temporary office at the university, a stark contrast to his carefully curated space. Books lay open on every surface, and hand-drawn mandalas covered one wall. "Tell me about your dreams," she said without a preamble. Thomas laughed. "I don't remember my dreams. Everyone dreams, not everyone listens." Elena handed him a small leather journal. "Keep this by your bed. Write down whatever fragments you recall upon waking, no matter how insignificant." "I'm not here as your patient," Thomas reminded her. "No, you're here as a fellow explorer of the psyche. But the unconscious speaks most clearly through dreams, especially the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge in waking life." That night, Thomas placed the journal on his nightstand. Sarah noticed. "New project?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Just professional research," he said, not meeting her eyes. How could he explain that he was exploring the possibility that his understanding of himself, and by extension of her, might be fundamentally flawed? For 3 nights, Thomas remembered nothing. On the 4th night, he dreamed of a vast library, where all the books were written in a language he couldn't read. A woman with Sarah's voice, but Elena's confidence, guided him through the stacks, insisting he already knew how to read the texts if he would only stop trying so hard. He wrote it down, feeling foolish. "The library represents your unconscious," Elena explained during their next meeting. "The books contain wisdom you can't access through your intellectual approach. The female guide is your anima, your inner feminine counterpart." Thomas frowned. "So my unconscious has taken your form?" "Not my form, your perception of what I represent, a challenge to your established thinking." Elena leaned forward. "Jung believed that a man's relationship with his anima determines his relationship with women. If you repress her, you'll project both your attraction and your fear onto the women in your life. You're suggesting my marriage problems stem from my relationship with myself. With parts of yourself you've disowned," Elena corrected. "Western culture trains men to reject sensitivity, intuition, receptivity, qualities arbitrarily labeled as feminine. The rejected parts don't disappear. They go underground and emerge in projected form." Thomas thought about Sarah's complaints, that he intellectualized everything, that he was emotionally unavailable, that he seemed to resent the very qualities that had attracted him to her initially. "What's the solution?" he asked. "Integration," Elena replied, "making conscious what has been unconscious, recognizing projections, reclaiming disowned aspects of yourself." That night, Sarah found him reading Jung's Ion in bed. "Haven't seen you read anything but research papers in years," she commented. "I'm exploring some new ideas," Thomas said, then added hesitantly, "Maybe we could talk about them sometime." Sarah looked surprised, then cautiously pleased. "I'd like that." Thomas's dreams became more frequent, more vivid. In one, he descended into a basement where a young boy, clearly himself, sat drawing intricate patterns. The boy looked up and asked, "Why did you leave me here alone?" Thomas woke with tears on his face. He shared the dream with Elena, who nodded thoughtfully. "The child represents your creative, emotional self, aspects you've neglected in favor of intellectual pursuits. The basement symbolizes the unconscious, where these qualities have been relegated." She reached for a large red leather book on her shelf, Jung's infamous Red Book, filled with his own visions, mandalas, and confrontations with his unconscious. Jung wrote this during his confrontation with the unconscious after breaking with Freud. For years he feared he was going mad. Instead, he was integrating aspects of himself he'd denied. She handed him the heavy volume. "This journey isn't intellectual, it's experiential." Thomas spent hours with Jung's strange, beautiful illustrations and cryptic text. One passage in particular resonated. "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." When Sarah asked about his growing distraction, Thomas found himself telling her about Jung, about the anima concept, about his sessions with Elena. "You're saying you've been projecting onto me?" Sarah asked, her tone unreadable. "I'm saying I might have been relating to an image of you rather than you yourself," Thomas admitted, "and that's not fair to either of us." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "This Elena sounds interesting. I'd like to meet her." The dinner was Elena's suggestion. "The anima work isn't abstract theory. It has real implications for your relationships. Including Sarah in our discussions might be valuable." Thomas felt unexpectedly nervous as he introduced the 2 women. Would Sarah see his interest in Elena's work as intellectual infidelity? Would Elena judge his marriage by clinical standards? His fears proved unfounded. Sarah, a literature professor, found Jung's archetypes fascinating from a narrative perspective. Elena respected Sarah's insights, often nodding in agreement when she spoke. Jung believed that men progress through 4 stages of anima development, Elena explained over dessert. Eve, the biological; Helen, the romantic; Mary, the spiritual; and Sophia, wisdom. But they're not just external figures, they're aspects of the masculine psyche seeking integration. In literature, female characters often serve as catalysts for male transformation, Sarah noted, but they rarely get to be complete people in their own right. Elena smiled. Exactly. That's the danger of projection. We reduce others to carriers of our own unconscious content. Thomas watched the interaction with growing discomfort. These women were discussing him as if he weren't present, or worse, as if he were a textbook. "In case, this is all very theoretical," he interjected, "but real relationships don't fit neatly into Jungian categories." Elena turned to him. "No, they don't. Theory is just a starting point. The real work happens when we recognize our projections in the moment, not after the fact." "And how exactly does one do that?" Thomas challenged. "By noticing when your emotional reactions are disproportionate to the situation," Elena replied, calmly. "Excessive admiration, irrational irritation, unreasonable fear. These are clues that you may be seeing your own unconscious content rather than the person before you." Sarah reached across the table and touched Thomas's hand. "Like when you get inexplicably angry at my spontaneity, even though you once said it was what drew you to me." Thomas felt exposed, defensive, and somewhere beneath that, grateful for her clarity. The dream came with brutal clarity. Thomas stood before a mirror that showed not his reflection but Sarah's. As he watched, her image morphed into Elena's, then into his mother's, then into a woman he didn't recognize, wild-eyed, unkempt, radiating primal power. He recoiled, but the mirror followed his movements. The wild woman spoke. "You cannot escape me. I am part of you." He woke shaking, fumbling for his journal. In his next session with Elena, she listened without interruption, then said quietly, "You've encountered your shadow anima, the feminine energy you most fear and reject." It was disturbing, Thomas admitted. Of course it was. The shadow contains everything we've been taught is unacceptable. For many men, the untamed feminine represents a terrifying loss of control. Thomas thought about his need for order, his discomfort with emotional displays, his subtle attempts to manage Sarah's behavior over the years. What do I do with this shadow anima? First, recognize that she's not external. She's a disowned part of yourself, Elena said. Second, understand that her energy isn't inherently destructive. It's only destructive when repressed and projected. And third, Thomas prompted, third, you begin a dialogue. The shadow wants acknowledgement, not suppression. That evening, Thomas cancelled his appointments and drove to the coast. Sitting on the empty beach, he watched the wild, rhythmic motion of the waves, feminine energy in its most elemental form. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel without analyzing, to experience without categorizing. When he returned home, Sarah noticed the change immediately. "You seem present," she said. "Where did you go today?" "To meet a part of myself I've been avoiding," Thomas replied. "I'm still not sure what to do with her." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at his candor. "Maybe you don't need to do anything. Maybe you just need to let her be." Elena suggested a joint session. "Jung saw marriage as the ultimate container for projection work," she explained. "It's where our unconscious material becomes most visible." In Elena's office, Sarah spoke first. "When we met, Thomas saw me as this free spirit who would bring spontaneity to his structured life. But whenever I actually act spontaneously, he tries to contain me." Thomas felt the familiar defensiveness rise. "Your spontaneity sometimes borders on irresponsibility." "Or perhaps," Eleanor suggested gently, It threatens the control you maintain over your own spontaneous impulses. The insight landed like a physical blow. Thomas recalled childhood reprimands for excessive enthusiasm, for crying too easily, for asking too many questions. He'd learned to contain himself, to present only his most rational, composed aspects. To the world, I think, he said slowly, I've been asking Sarah to manage parts of myself I don't trust. Sarah's expression softened. And I've been projecting too. I've cast you as the rigid authority figure who limits my freedom, just like my father. Elena nodded. Jung called marriage a psychological relationship. Its purpose isn't just companionship, but mutual growth through the withdrawal of projections. When we stop using our partners as screens for our unconscious material, we can finally see them and ourselves clearly. That night, Thomas and Sarah talked until dawn, not about schedules or responsibilities or grievances, but about dreams, both the sleeping and waking kind, about the people they'd been before they met, the people they'd hoped to become together, the people they might still be. I don't know how to do this, Thomas confessed. I don't know how to see you without the filter of my own needs and fears. Sarah took his hand. Maybe we learn together. Thomas's evolving perspective began affecting his professional work. During a conference presentation on male identity development, he deviated from his prepared remarks to discuss the anima concept and the danger of projection. Our cultural definition of masculinity is fundamentally reactive, he told the startled audience. We define manhood not by what it is, but by what it isn't, not feminine, not weak, not emotional. This creates men who are strangers to themselves, projecting their disowned qualities onto women, then either idealizing or demonizing them for carrying what the men themselves cannot bear to acknowledge. The response was polarized. Some colleagues accused him of abandoning empirical psychology for mystical Jungianism. Others, particularly younger psychologists and female colleagues, expressed excitement about his new direction, his publisher called concerned about his in-progress book. On male achievement. This new angle doesn't fit the brand we've built for you, the editor warned. Thomas found himself at a crossroads. Continue with work that no longer resonated with his evolving understanding, or risk his professional standing by following this new path? Elena offered no easy answers. Jung himself faced this dilemma. His break with Freudian orthodoxy cost him dearly in professional terms, but he couldn't continue advocating ideas that contradicted his deepest insights. What did he choose? Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. Integrity, Elena replied, at great personal cost. That evening, Thomas began outlining a new book, one that explored the consequences of masculine shadow repression and anima projection in contemporary society. Sarah found him working late. You seem energized, she observed. I'm risking everything. Professionally, Thomas admitted. But it feels right, Sarah smiled. Welcome to how I live all the time. As Thomas integrated more of his disowned feminine aspects, his dreams of the wild woman transformed. She appeared now not as a threatening figure, but as a guide, leading him through unfamiliar but fascinating landscapes. She's becoming a positive anima figure, Elena explained. As you make peace with these aspects of yourself, the projected image changes from threatening to nurturing. But she's still separate from me in the dreams, Thomas noted. Complete integration is a lifelong process, Elena said. Jung believed few people achieve it fully. The goal isn't to eliminate the anima as a distinct presence, but to establish a conscious relationship with her. Thomas found himself more intuitive in his therapy practice, more attentive to emotional undercurrents with his clients. He meditated regularly and even began painting, clumsily at first, then with increasing confidence. The creative process. He felt both foreign and deeply familiar, like remembering a language he'd known in childhood. Sarah watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Sometimes "I feel like I'm living with a different man," she confessed one evening. "Is that difficult?" Thomas asked. "It's disorienting," she admitted. "I got used to your predictability, even while complaining about it. Now I need to get to know you again." Thomas realized that his growth was forcing Sarah to confront her own projections. She could no longer cast him as the emotionally unavailable intellectual against whom she defined her free-spirited identity. "Perhaps," he suggested carefully, "we're both being called to discover who we are without our familiar projections." Elena's fellowship was ending. Before her departure, she invited both Thomas and Sarah for a final session. Jung focused primarily on the male psychological journey, she acknowledged. His work on the female psyche, the animus concept, was less developed and more influenced by the gender norms of his time. "I've noticed," Sarah said dryly. "Contemporary Jungian analysts have expanded this work," Elena continued. "Women, too, project their disowned masculine aspects, assertiveness, logical thinking, autonomy, onto men, then either idealize or resent them for embodying these qualities." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've always been drawn to creative, spontaneous women as friends, but to more structured, intellectual men as partners. I've never quite integrated those aspects in myself." "The journey is similar but not identical," Elena explained. "For women in patriarchal cultures, reclaiming masculine aspects often means reclaiming power that has been systematically denied. For men, integrating feminine aspects means embracing vulnerability that has been culturally shamed." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, recognizing how their individual journeys had both complemented and complicated their relationship. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "How do we continue this work without your guidance?" Elena smiled. "The true guide has always been within each of you. I've merely helped you recognize its voice." 6 months after Elena's departure, Thomas received an email with a Swiss postmark. It contained a single quote from Jung. "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Below, Elena had written, "How goes the journey?" Thomas sat at his desk, reflecting on the past months. His new book, The Integrated Masculine, had found a small but passionate audience. His therapy practice had evolved to include dream work and shadow integration alongside traditional approaches. His relationship with Sarah had transformed through periods of intense conflict and profound connection as they both struggled to withdraw their projections and see each other clearly. He opened a drawer and removed the dream journal, now filled with months of entries. The wild woman still appeared, but now as a collaborative presence rather than an opposing force. Sometimes in his dreams, he and she even merged briefly, creating moments of wholeness that lingered upon waking. Sarah entered his study, paintbrushes in hand. They had converted the spare room into a shared creative space, his writing desk beside her easel. "Working?" she asked. "Reflecting," he replied. Elena checked in. Sarah smiled. "What will you tell? Her?" Thomas considered the question. The journey had been neither linear nor easy. There had been regressions, arguments where old projection patterns reasserted themselves, times when integration seemed impossible. But beneath the struggles, something fundamental had shifted. "I'll tell her that I'm beginning to understand Jung's most important lesson," he said finally, "that the parts of ourselves we reject don't disappear. They shape our perceptions, our attractions, our conflicts, and that real love, real connection, becomes possible only when we reclaim these disowned aspects of ourselves." Sarah set down her brushes and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Not just understanding, Thomas. Living it." He covered her hand with his own, feeling the presence of the wild woman, not as a separate entity, but as a vital part of his own expanded consciousness. "Living it," he agreed, however imperfectly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, Carl Jung.